Tuesday, and thanks and welcome to the Axiom Medical Infection Control live stream here with us today. Quick background for those of you who may be new or stumbled upon us here in your social feeds there. My name is Holly Foxworth. I'm a registered nurse. I'm also the marketing manager for content here at Axiom Medical. And as always, I have some of the brightest minds that are joining the conversation today. I have Chief Legal and HR Officer Chuck Kable, along with Lead Counsel for Legislative Planning and Analysis, Elizabeth Simo. So they're going to weigh in specifically on some of the policy considerations for workplace health, and then also understanding some of those risk mitigation strategies that would also incorporate some of the infection control standards. So before we get to that, and before I have them introduce themselves, I do want to just mention that we do have a live stream that's coming up this Thursday. In case you missed it this last week, the webinar that was with Dr. Cherry and Dara Wheeler, and so we talked about some of the heat-related illnesses and some of the safety factors that go around that. I will say that what jumped out at me and has left me thinking about that since then was specific to that we all think that this is a common issue that we face every year. And so we kind of become immune, or we think that we have it all figured out. And, you know, at the very least, it's very inconvenient. It can cause issues for your employees, but at the very worst there, you also see that there are some fatal outcomes that are associated with this. So we went through some great strategies. We're going to do a quick recap on that. We also talked through one of the most compelling case stories I think that I've ever heard in my healthcare career, was where we compared the two outcomes that were based specifically on the one decision that the supervisor made whenever there were two employees, same position, same exact symptoms, but different locations, different supervisors. One supervisor advised that employee to go to the ER. They had a full workup. The bill totaled over like $38,000, I think it was. And then you had another that went in a different direction, utilized some of the nurse triage concepts, and had a first aid outcome there. So it's really powerful stuff. Great information to think about, not only for the prevention measures with some of the hydration and breaks and things like that, but also making sure that your supervisors know what to do and they're prepared in the event that they were to encounter one of these scenarios. So definitely, we hope you'll join us for that follow-up and get to some of those additional questions we didn't get to in the webinar. And that'll be Thursday, so this week, as in 2 days from now at 1:00 p.m. Central on our social channels. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and have Chuck and Elizabeth both introduce yourselves, and then we'll also jump into infection control and all the different components that go along with that. Chuck, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Chuck Kable. I'm Chief Legal Officer, and also I run HR for Axiom Medical. Been a lawyer for about 20 years, and I'm happy to be here today to talk some more about what I've been talking about for a while, this infection control in the workplace stuff. So thank you for being here. Elizabeth?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm lead counsel here of legislative analysis and planning with Axiom Medical, and I'm excited to get in depth about infectious disease control.
Fantastic.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. Well, Chuck, do you want to just go ahead and get started? We'll kind of come to you first, and you can kind of talk us through the evolution of workplace infection control, and we'll
Yeah, sure. So first, let's talk about the title today, right? Which, you know, OSHA-Mandated infection control policy. So for a long time now, those of you that have kind of followed our webinars have heard me and members of my team and members of Axiom talk a lot about our expectation that OSHA was going to come out with a kind of a full-blown emergency temporary standard for infection control for many different kinds of businesses. I think that now where we are today is that didn't happen. What we saw happen was OSHA did announce an emergency temporary standard, but limited application to healthcare. And so a few thoughts on that, and then we can kind of dive into the material for today. You know, I think that while, you know, we were right in terms of what we expected kind of that standard to contain, right? Kind of concept of a planning approach, policy development, PPE, testing, et cetera. The limitation to one industry was a bit of a surprise initially, but I think when you look back in time and you see kind of the situational dynamic, it made sense to me. I think that if OSHA had been pushed to announced this standard back in March when it was originally supposed to come out, we likely would have seen a broader group of folks kind of participating in that, or broader industries, I should say, being involved in that. And so what had happened since March was we started to see vaccinations pick up. We started to see infection rates drop. We started to see a lot of states open up. There was much more kind of pressure on the administration to back away from a standard that could potentially have a negative impact on economic growth and rebounding of employment and all the things that we're reading in the news every day. And so, not to mention the fact that when OSHA was considering this standard, if you go back and look at kind of the docket, which is the explanation of meetings and everything leading up to formal announcement, there were just a ton of stakeholders and groups that were being engaged to provide input rather, and feedback on the proposed emergency standard. So I think through that evolution, my suspicion is the original version of that standard that was presented to the White House at first, compared to what it is today, was very different, right? I think the guts of it was probably somewhat similar, but I think ultimately, healthcare was a smoother path as well, because you already had the bloodborne pathogen standard. There was already an established kind of protocol. I think that the group of workers that were most directly impacted, both through the pandemic and now that we're seeing it decline, was the healthcare sector. Public policy dictated that those groups needed to have probably a more definitive protection standard, which is why OSHA did what it did. So here we are, right? So we're right on the one hand and wrong on the other. But I think that what I really want to focus on and talk about today is the situational dynamic kind of leading into the pandemic and where we find ourselves today and where we should go now based on guidance and other input or information we're getting from OSHA. So think about this for a minute. So businesses across the United States took steps way back when the pandemic started to essentially create infection control practices. Why? Because they needed to keep the lights on, they needed to keep people employed, they needed to continue to generate revenue. There was, for essential services businesses, there was a need to continue putting food on the table of Americans everywhere. There was a need to continue providing energy and electricity, gas, etc. So businesses had to take action, not because government was telling them you need to do these things to keep your people safe. They had to do it it was part of the fabric of the business to ensure that people could show up and they could continue to maintain a reasonably safe environment, right? Which is why Axiom obviously had a huge opportunity to come in and provide the services that we provide to help keep kind of people safe at work through the pandemic. So it's an interesting dynamic where kind of the laws of supply and demand, essentially, if you think about economic theory for a minute, we're dictating behavior here. Right? We had to take action to prevent our workforce from not being able to work because the consequence was potential workforce or business destruction. Interesting thing. And so businesses took a bunch of steps based on CDC guidance, based on World Health Organization guidance, based on businesses like Axiom Medical to maintain the safety of their workforce. Okay. So understanding that steps have been taken. So there is some trailing evidence to suggest that there's value being provided by an infection control approach. The question now becomes, as we look forward, right? And I'm going to jump ahead in the deck a little bit here. Businesses are very much at an inflection point, right? Do we take all the stuff that we've learned and all the stuff that we've done to protect our workforces from illness, throw it all away and go back to the way it was? States are reopening, mask mandates are going away, people are getting vaccinated, right? So do we take all this kind of cost and throw it out the window and just go like this never happened before? Or do we learn, take some of what we've done over the past year and a half, apply in our businesses on a go-forward basis, and measure against potential perceived value and benefits moving forward? What am I talking about there? Again, everybody say it with me now. $180 billion with a B of lost time every year from people being sick, and not showing up to work. There's a lot of different reasons for that. There's mental health issues, and I fully expect mental health to become a larger issue for employees and employers moving forward, causing lost time from work. I think statistically, it's like 27 days lost on average for folks experiencing mental health challenges. And we expect to see that increase over time, by the way, based on everything that's happened with COVID and remote work and people losing their jobs and getting jobs and the pressures associated with working from home and all that other good stuff, right? So that's truly the question. And so how should we think about that? How should for the health and safety folks on the live stream today, one of the biggest challenges that kind of struck us when we talked to some of our clients was they're interested in creating a protocol and a process that they can utilize on an ongoing basis to protect their workforce and protect themselves from liability, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the challenge now is, how do we get our operational folks, right, the money makers, to buy into additional cost required to do it? Because you can't do it for free. People have to track it, whether it's your own folks, whether you buy the service from somebody else. You have to have, there's some cost that's, essential in terms of providing this kind of a protection for your employees. There's policies that have to be created. They have to be enforced. They have to be kind of checks against those policies. So how do you think about that as a business? And I think where you start is you start to kind of really drill down and talk about not just, what happened with COVID, but what has happened historically relative to that issue of lost sick time and lost productivity, and what kind of value do you think you can get from a more comprehensive approach to managing illness in the workplace? Okay. And so that's kind of where I'm coming at today. It's some of what we're going to kind of get in today. And leading into this discussion more generally, historically, OSHA took the position that generally illnesses in the workplace were not going to be considered acquired at work. It was kind of just something that happened, and there was no penalty associated with it. What we saw with COVID was OSHA took some steps to suggest that COVID was in fact work-related under certain situations. And employers then had to take steps to ensure that they were prepared to address any challenges that OSHA may have made relative to that kind of issue. Like, was it acquired at work or was it not? We saw that under the Trump administration, there was not as much activity as perhaps there would have been in years prior to that. That's not a political statement. That's simply looking at the volume of investigations. Some of that could very well be related to COVID itself and people not working, right? But what we do expect to see is an increase. They're upscaling the department. OSHA's going to have more investigators. They've said they're going to audit more businesses. So what does that mean for you? And how does it play into the fact that there's no specific standard that may apply to your business as a meat packer or as a oil and gas kind of vendor, whatever the case may be? When OSHA made this announcement that under certain circumstances, COVID was going to be considered, acquired at work, it kind of is a moment for all of us to raise our hands and say, wait a minute. So there are circumstances where OSHA is willing to suggest that illness acquired at work is in fact job related and could result in a reportable. It could create other challenges for that workplace. But at the same time, OSHA also announced guidance relative to how workers or employers rather should think about risk presented by their workforce, right? This is that risk leveling approach we've talked about before. The publication specifically came out in March of 2020, and it had a risk pyramid, very high, medium, low. I think there are these very different standards, but it was based on both the role that person served in and any unique personal features of that individual that could have contributed to a higher risk, i.e., are they vaccinated? Are they not? Do they have pre-existing health conditions that were demonstrated to show an increased risk rather of hospitalization or worse infection? So when you start to put together these pieces, I think that there is still a risk that OSHA has already announced its intent in certain circumstances to find an illness as recordable.
Right.
So that has to be evaluated as we look forward. State plans are becoming more aggressive, right? We've got a lot of state developments that have occurred. Actually, Elizabeth, I think this is something that you keep track of. Do you have something to add relative to the state plans?
Yeah, there's definitely been a renewed focus on state-based OSHA plans. And recently, California's Cal OSHA has recently updated their guidelines, and they're seen as a benchmark in that space as well. So within Cal OSHA, they definitely started looking towards vaccinated, unvaccinated employees, in which vaccinated employees, they will have more relaxed protocols in terms of not being required to wear face masks or being required to have the 6 feet distancing as well. However, unvaccinated workers will still have to follow the face mask protocol and the 6 feet physical distancing. One thing, however, to note with that that is that employers are required to ask documentation from the employees regarding their vaccination status, which is whether the employee provides the vaccination card or the employer reviews the vaccination card and keeps a record that it was reviewed and affirmed by the employer. So in this case, we're going to start seeing employers start asking for verifiable documentation in regards to vaccination in the workplace. And so that will definitely enable employers to at least try to keep track of potential transmissions in the workplace and just the various interactions that could lead to an outbreak as well.
Yeah, great points. And one other kind of, if I can stack on that for a minute, I think that the other kind of big issue that's coming up is, a lot of our clients are asking us about, vaccines and, how do we track them? Or rather they're telling us, we want to know and we want to see how this pans out, but we don't want to violate privacy rights. Right. I think that businesses need to ask themselves, what information do they want from their team members and for what purpose, right? So if you're attempting to identify the relative risk of outbreak for a given distribution center, for example, that's a work-related, business necessity type inquiry that you're allowed to get under the ADA, which is kind of the prevailing fit for duty standard that we're utilizing across the country relative to this kind of medical inquiry, right? Which is permissible in these circumstances, I would argue, right? And so it's thinking through, what documents, what policy do I need to give me access that I can use today to demonstrate safety, health, wellness. By the way, right, this is becoming a big part of ESG initiatives, environmental, social, and governance at the board level. And so part of the way in which you can demonstrate your commitment to, your employees is by providing a safe and health environment for them. And so this kind of plays into some of these initiatives that are gaining steam as well, just generally, both for private and public businesses. And so I think that when you're having these conversations, when operations or whomever, finance, accounting, raising their hands saying, we got to talk about cost here. Yes, of course you do. But at the same time, there is a huge risk mitigation opportunity presented for any business that's willing to engage in a very fundamental assessment of the risk of illness in their workplace. And it doesn't take a lot of effort here to kind of go through a process to identify a policy approach that gives you access to information that then allows you to kind of go back and measure relative to prior years what's happening with people taking sick time or paid time off because they're ill, right? You're allowed to ask, or if you're sick, can you please confirm that you're sick? And the impact that has on productivity, right? And so you can start to see some improvements in other key performance indicators and turnover rates and employee NPS scores, right? There's other benefits that are going to start to occur here. But again, right, the fundamental kind of question is, if you go back to the way it was and say, we're done, we're moving forward, we're good with everything, we're not going to continue any of this stuff that we did before because we're good now, right? What happens next time? And I'm not trying to be a fearmonger, but I don't know when it's going to happen next. I mean, we've had a number of epidemics in the United States, primarily focused on, hospital-acquired infections, right? But now we've got this potential for continued mutations of COVID. Experts are saying we have to learn to live with it. In this environment, businesses have to ask themselves, what's my obligation under the general duty clause of OSHA to provide a safe work environment for my employees? And does it extend to having some process, some policy in effect to make sure that those folks are not unreasonably in a position to get sick from their coworkers? I think this is going to continue to develop, even though we've seen OSHA kind of take these baby steps. As I've said before, infection control has been on the short list for years. We had a Republican administration that kind of called time out on a lot of it. Democrats are back in office now. That machine's gonna churn back up, and I think at some point we're going to start to see additional discussion about a permanent infection control standard for things like air travel, cruises, right? Another big deal. We're talking to cruise lines about all these challenges. There's a ton of challenges here. But again, when you come back to kind of fundamentally thinking about the risk presented, thinking about policies and procedures that you can create and implement, one of the things that's become a huge kind of opportunity for risk mitigation are these daily health assessments, right? People are kind of, checking in every day. Do you have any symptoms today? running through a list. It doesn't have to be limited to COVID. It can be flu, strep. The consequences of getting flagged are going to be different, right? It's like, oh, okay, you got a fever. Wait a day. When your fever's gone, you can come back in instead of waiting whatever it was, 7 days, and then getting 2 negatives or whatever the process was, depending on the client. But those are the things to begin to think through and iterate on, because there are going to be benefits that will be obtained by the business, and there will be risk mitigation, right? The door's been open. We've got these lawsuits kind of all over the country relative to folks that, either died or were seriously injured because of the lasting effects of COVID. The door's been opened, and case law is being developed and will continue to be developed that will have an impact on employers' obligations in the workplace. It'll take a while probably to fully manifest, but I think it's something for all of us to think about. And so for those of us willing to have an approach that's consistent and uniformly applied through a policy, it's going to be a lot easier to manage those things as they come up, down the road. I did a whole lot of talking. Sorry.
That's okay. You're good. Great information. What I would ask you about this though is that, I think when we look at the bigger conversation, there's a little bit of a disconnect though. Like, we understand maybe the concept of infection control policies having a healthcare background, but those that don't have a healthcare background, this is a new concept to them. So could you take us through what that would look like by first explain what that would be, and then maybe doing a comparison of what benefits there would be should there be another pandemic that were to occur? What would that look? How would that differ?
Sure. So generally, right, an infection control policy is going to have a couple core components, right? You're going to kind of identify, under what circumstances infection can be spread, droplets, the vector, right, how it's acquired. You're going to speak to your workforce, whether it's centrally located, whether it's remote and, centrally hub and spoke, whatever it may be. And then you're going to speak to, very generally, the risk presented for those different groups. For example, a remote population is going to have low risk because they're working from home and it's like a desk-based job, very low risk. Minimal requirement for those folks, simply that if they do happen to have, kind of meetings, they need to make sure they're socially distanced. If in the event there's an epidemic or a regional outbreak or a pandemic, for example. And then you list out administrative controls, engineering controls, PPE requirements. That's like where they wear a mask, those kinds of things. That's all part of this. And then this kind of daily healthcare attestation, that's another tool in the toolbox for folks that do have kind of an environment that is more maybe retail facing or warehouse facing, or, pick your poison, right? No pun intended, meat packing, whatever it may be. You can create kind of through that risk leveling, right? Let me back up for a minute. So risk leveling, for folks that don't know that, is you're going to look at, let's say you work in a warehouse and you have 3 different jobs. You have a remote bookkeeper that works from home. You have a warehouse person that's in the warehouse, and then you have like a shipping person. Okay. So the person that works from home is low risk under the risk scale. The person that's kind of the warehouse kind of person that's running around pulling orders, that works with, let's say, another 20 people in close proximity, they're going to be a medium to high risk, depending upon how consistently they're next to others in the warehouse, right? And so then you look, okay, so for those folks, the way we're going to mitigate risk is we're going to make sure we sanitize, common areas. We're going to make sure they're wearing masks when they have to be within certain areas of the warehouse where other people are consistently kind of working. Hand hygiene, right? Washing your hands consistently, those kinds of things are all be part of it. So to designate the kind of the risk profile and the mitigating factors. Now, you may say, for example, that job is, let's call it a high risk role. However, for folks that are vaccinated, that maybe becomes a medium risk and they don't have to wear masks. So you can change kind of the scale based upon the unique kind of healthcare factors of that individual, right? If they have pre-existing conditions that we know kind of lend themselves to hospitalization, they may be very high risk. And so vaccination may put them from very high to high. They're still going to have to wear masks until we have more information on vaccines and impact on hospitalizations. I don't know, right? Like, these are the things to think through. And then you've got the shipping coordinator who doesn't talk to anybody. All they do is kind of push everything to UPS or the shipping company, and they just have to wear a mask when they're talking to somebody else. So maybe they're medium risk. So you want to have that kind of stratification of risk embedded in the policy, either, listing out the roles with the risk level as you believe it to be, or saying for each role, we're going to do this, and then you can come back to it later if you just need to get something on paper. And then you're talking through administrative controls, which is policy creation, policy enforcement, right? How often are you going to check against whether people are doing the things that are in the policy? Engineering controls like air filtration. Are you going to have a HEPA filter? How often does that get addressed? The disinfection of common areas, those kinds of things, right? Everything that is, it's somewhat tailored to your environment and your business is the way you should think about it, because you don't want to, on the one hand, you could have kind of a huge policy that's based upon like a true healthcare setting. You don't need that if you're a distribution center or warehouse. At the same time, you need something that's kind of scaled down, but still addresses, between shifts, you got multiple people putting their hands on the steering wheel of the forklift. Maybe you want to disinfect the forklift steering wheel, between every shift or whatever the case may be. Those are the kinds of things to think through. And again, it doesn't have to be some huge document, but it has to have kind of these basic things that speak about, infection is a risk. It's important for us to maintain our workforce. And so by insulating ourselves from illness, we're helping maintain that kind of minimum necessary to do the job that's required. And then you go through and list out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. You can do it by one. You can have one policy. You can have add-ons. Some people like to do add-ons where they talk about PPE, only applicable when there's an epidemic. I mean, whatever the standard is. Again, some of this is that balance between the money-making portions of the business not wanting to be hamstrung. Yeah. But at the same time, I think part of the challenge when you start something new like this is that challenge, right? It's like, wait a minute, why do we have to do this? Like, things are better. We're good. But when you think about historical context, well, no, it's not better. You just learn to live with everything that was there before the pandemic happened. So why not leverage this opportunity to continue to improve morale, which will have an impact on culture, which will have an impact on turnover. There's other things, right? I know some of this is kind of wishy-washy for the finance people that may be listening in, but there's value to be had there. And I think it's balancing. You got to balance it against what you've seen historically, pressure test it to see if you're getting benefits out of it today. I imagine you will. And then even if you have challenges, like if it's cost neutral, you still need to kind of engage in this process because there's going to be mitigating circumstances down the road you can leverage, whether it's OSHA, whether it's work comp, whether it's litigation. There's going to be opportunities here, but businesses have to think about it and they have to evaluate, those issues not in a vacuum.
Yeah. So we did have actually several town hall questions that we have gotten frequently. They seem to come up regularly. And so I wanted to roll through a couple of those. I think the first one we may have already answered, where we were talking about the different components that would need to be included in the infection control policy. Was there anything else specifically that maybe you wanted to add to that, Chuck, or do you feel like we pretty much covered it?
I don't know, Elizabeth, did I miss anything? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we fully covered that area as well. I think we definitely just need to be just cognizant of just the various rates of low vaccinations in certain areas, and then look forward to possibly having some industry specific OSHA regulations come in as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent points. All right. The next one that we had was specific to the infection control policy and what should be addressed, and should that be different for locations? I know that you had mentioned, the remote workers, those would be a little bit different, but could you also have changes by different location based on maybe what the infection transmission level was, et cetera, in the various different counties?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, there's a lot of freedom here, right? So the other piece to this is, because we don't have kind of a firm, you must do this other than for healthcare, there's flexibility. And so thinking about the business model, the ways in which you're earning your revenue, where you see pockets of risk, just start there. Yeah. And then in terms of a training regimen, typically best practice suggests when you implement a new policy, you got to train when you implement, have people sign off on it, whatever mechanism you utilize for that, like what you do for a handbook. Mm-hmm. Provide some level of education, like how to wash your hands appropriately. And there's videos out there you can buy and put into a learning management system, or you can kind of do it in person, whatever suits your business. but have kind of qualified folks come in and provide that. This is how you wear a mask. If you're a business that has a respirator standard, you got to maintain that, but that provides you with a lot of insulation as well. But you want to do it when folks are hired. When you implement the policy, you got to do it for everybody.
Right.
When folks are hired, you should do it. And then having a recurring training just to make sure you're capturing folks. Maybe it's once a year after that. Maybe it's once every 6 months. I mean, it all kind of depends on how quickly you're turning over your workforce too. But having an approach where, because you train somebody when they're getting hired, there's a lot of information, but you're checking a box, right? They're trained on it. They're good. When you come back and you do that training again within 6 or 8 months, whatever that kind of timeline is, okay, right? I got this now. This is why we're doing it. This is why it's important, but I would talk to your training folks. If you don't have training folks, then I think it's a combination of leadership kind of identifying what makes the most sense for the business relative to how often. Monthly is probably too much. This is all part of that cost equation too, because when you're pulling people off the line or pulling them away to kind of do training, they're not able to do their jobs. So you got to think through that too and come up with the right balance for your business. So I don't have a firm answer for you, but those are the kinds of things I would think about.
Yeah, definitely. And then the next one that we had was specific to, they were asking, by developing a policy, would that help from a workplace transmission liability perspective?
So it's not a guarantee,
but it helps.
Right? Because if all you're doing is saying we got this piece of paper, we're good. That's not enough. Usually it's you got the piece of paper, people are complying with the paper, and you've got an approach in place to confirm that people are complying with the paper. Right? That's kind of the way that any kind of policy execution, an administration approach needs to happen, because that's how you prove that you've done nothing wrong, that you took the steps you were supposed to take, that you're complying with your own policy. You can't just show them the paper. Now, is the paper better than nothing? Yeah, it is. But typically when you're involved in litigation or any kind of adversarial proceeding where you're kind of digging a little bit deeper than just the kind of high level issues, you're going to dig a level below. Okay, you got the policy, that's great. Who's in charge of administering it? How often are they trained on it? What do you do to make sure people comply with it? If you can't answer any of those questions, it's not going to do as much as it would otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
Elizabeth, do you have a different? I'm going to give her a chance to, because I've been doing all the talking. I mean, what do you think?
No, I definitely agree. I think that the application of the policy definitely speaks to the liability of an organization. So if you have the policy in place, being able to apply that policy effectively can definitely absolve you or, reduce any type of liability in that case.
Yeah. Totally. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that the policy is the starting point here. So it's definitely great to have a policy, but that definitely is where we start. But you also have things that follow behind that. Yeah. All right. Good. All right. Let's see. I think we also had one about vaccine requirements and how those fit into the infectious disease puzzle. And I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I mean, obviously this has been a big, media circuit. We've spent it numerous different ways around, but it's always came back to, do you have the right to require employees to utilize vaccines or to get the vaccines? And so, we're interested in what your thought is here.
Elizabeth, you want to take a crack at that?
Oh, definitely. So, I guess outside the employment sphere, vaccination is voluntary. However, employers are allowed to require employees to be vaccinated. However, in returning to the infectious disease control scheme that we're dealing with, we have an emergence of a new variant. So we have the Delta variant that we're dealing with, and as people return to work, we have to we have to identify the various modes of transmission and human error that may occur that may result in an outbreak, especially when in regards to unvaccinated employees and the new variant. Chuck always speaks to the loss of work as a result of infectious disease control. So employers are definitely going to have to look at how they counteract and identify the interactions in the workplace and for individuals who are at high risk.
Yeah, totally. Go ahead.
Well,
Helen.
I was going to ask you if you could also, one of you could speak to the ADA components in this, where we talk about mandatory vaccines. How does that play into this?
So it's interesting, right? So EEOC has already come out and said, well, yeah, right. I mean, we've never said you can't. We've actually said that employers can require vaccines, but you have to have an appropriate mechanism for people to opt out if it's discriminatory, if there's like, what's the catchphrase for religious beliefs, like sincerely held religious beliefs, those kinds of things. Like the standard has always been that. I think what we see in the press, right? You've got kind of this Methodist hospital issue, which I call them out because we're in Houston, so they said, look, everybody has to get vaccinated by a date, otherwise you're going to get fired. Mm-hmm. And so, they're holding to that. There was a lawsuit attempted in federal court, and the judge said, no, all these arguments that you're making are not valid, and the rule is they can require it, and your choice then is to go find a new job somewhere else where they don't require it if you don't want to do that. And so, what the wrinkle that people have such a challenge with is to say, we've got, I think this is like the knee jerk we're getting in terms of the current vaccination approach is, it's people see this kind of emergency use, not licensed yet. And they're kind of hanging their hat on those words to say, well, that means that, I know in that Methodist case, they tried to make an argument that they were human guinea pigs, right? Yeah. Which is, you're not in the clinical trials, right? We're kind of past that. So that was part of the kind of reason for the risk there. But I think it doesn't sit well with certain folks because of this uncertainty, and you get misinformation, and you get this conglomeration of good information, bad information, stories you're hearing from your friends, you're getting on social media, and it's just a hot mess. And so people are having a hard time accepting an employer saying do that versus an employer saying get a flu, you have to get a flu shot, mm-hmm. which people just get.
Yeah.
So
good information. I think we did have one more question that came through. Katie was asking about if we were to have an illness outbreak at one of our plants, would there be a reporting requirement and potentially an inspection by OSHA?
So if you're talking about COVID, maybe. It's not guaranteed, but there's not a no there either, right? I think that it's all about, I think the last guidance that OSHA put out was their primary focus was going to be on the process. They were going to audit the process by which the employer made the determination whether the infection was acquired at work or not. Think about that for a minute. The process used to make the determination, not the determination. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like they're going to audit your thought process on this. They're going to audit your evidence that you used relative to COVID, right? So to me, what that means is if you have an outbreak with a really bad result, meaning death or serious injury that finds its way to OSHA through a complaint process, or if you happen to get randomly audited, like in the middle of an outbreak, that's the fundamental challenge, right? So how do you prove a process?
Yeah.
The answer is policy.
Yep.
With an auditable, like an audit log, like this is our approach, daily healthcare assessments. We've got, people, sanitizing, and there's a checklist, and it gets checked every time they're coming here and get sanitized. You see what I'm saying? So this kind of proves the point. It's a broad question, so I don't mean to kind of disrespect the person answering or asking the question here. It is very broadly drafted. Mm-hmm. So the answer is there could be.
Right.
If you have any illness, what I would say today is COVID is the one that's been specifically called out by OSHA mm-hmm. as one that they're going to investigate and dig in on. If you're talking about strep throat or flu or, whatever, they've not announced any changes relative to that stuff today. Okay. But then you think through like, well, what about, illnesses that have symptoms that are similar to COVID? At the outset, how do you kind of manage that? So somebody may have symptoms and it really ends up the flu. Somebody else has symptoms and it's COVID.
Yeah.
How do you figure that out? Like, are you doing a rule out? How do you do a rule out? How do we do that? Are people being tested? Are they not? So there's some interesting, there continue to be some interesting challenges that are coming out of this as we people are calling this the next phase of the pandemic. which is learning how to live with it. And that's essentially where we're at, right? That's truly the inflection point. And in my mind, the inflection point is actually two separate areas. It's how do we learn to live with COVID, and how do we learn to adjust our thinking around how we're managing infection in the workplace generally? And are we getting benefits? I think the answer is yes, or will be yes. But we got to figure it out because it's a balance, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Guys, you both had some great information. I guess the final question I'll close with, and I'd love to hear the input from both of you, is that even though this is being mandated only for healthcare per se, where is the value in where is the value in adopting this practice in other industries and other businesses?
Elizabeth, go ahead.
I mean, I would definitely say Chuck made a good point in terms of speaking to the cold and flu and allergies, and COVID intertwined. When you look at the symptoms, they can very well mesh. And so when you're trying to identify whether or not the employee has the flu, the cold, or COVID, you don't want to create hysteria in the workplace. You don't want to hurt your auditing. So with that being said, we're definitely going to have to address how we define those symptoms and how we categorize those individuals moving forward.
So let me answer that by talking about some previous experiences I've had. So I used to work for a business. It was a hospital business. Healthcare is kind of where I came from. And every year we would put a ton of effort in forecasting flu season, because the emergency rooms that were part of our health system, if it was a bad flu season, would see a huge bump in volume, right? And that's a big deal. Flu season is a big deal for emergency rooms. It's a big deal for hospitals. Now, for integrated delivery networks, they've got a whole bunch of surgery, elective surgeries, et cetera, that they make a lot of their money on. But when you're looking at the ER side of the house, I mean, there was a ton of value to be had if we had a bad flu season, ironically. Think about that for a minute.
Well, guys, yeah, I'm sorry.
We're done.
Did I lose you?
I'm here.
Okay. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, I think this has been some great information that we've discussed, especially specific to these policies and moving forward, and how it is that you can move your business forward from a protective standpoint there. So a lot of good information. Just a quick reminder that we do have the live stream for the heat-related illnesses. That's going to be on Thursday. We also still have the free white paper for how it is that you can develop some of these vaccination plans, especially for your employees, so that you can protect them with that additional level there. So if you have any questions about any of those, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Obviously, we'll be putting out some additional information about this program and how we can help you if you wanted to develop a policy. So any questions we can help you with, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we will see you then on Thursday.